She humiliated an elderly man in a wheelchair at the bank counter, not knowing he quietly owned the entire branch. And in less than an hour, she was out of a job. The automatic doors of Guardian, State Bank's West Haven branch, hissed open at 9:03 a.m. a morning. Sunlight spilled onto the freshly mopped floors, as 63-year-old Elliot Dandridge quietly rolled through the entrance in his wheelchair. He wore a slate-gray windbreaker, a worn baseball cap pulled low over his brow, and a calm expression that seemed permanently stitched into his features. He didn't look like someone important, and that was exactly the point. Elliot made a slow circle of the lobby before approaching the front reception desk. The bank had only just opened, and most of the employees were still sipping from paper cups and adjusting their name badges. A few clients sat scattered in the waiting area, heads bowed over their phones. The room smelled faintly of printer toner and lemon-scented floor polish. "Excuse me," Elliot said gently. "Could I speak with the branch manager, please?" Behind the counter, Megan Alcott glanced up. Mid-30s platinum blonde, thick mascara and a sharp bob that framed her face, like two razor blades. She didn't smile. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, not even looking at him properly. "No, I don't," Elliot replied, "but I'd appreciate." She cut him off with a raised palm. Then, as if Elliot wasn't even standing, well, sitting right there in front of her, she turned to a coworker and said under her breath, "Betty's here to cash somebody else's check, or complain about something we can't fix." The words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. They were loud enough. A few heads turned in the waiting area. A teenage boy sitting with his mother shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The mother frowned clearly, unsure whether she'd heard what she thought she heard. Elliot paused, blinked slowly, and tilted his head. Not in disbelief, but calculation. He hadn't expected this branch to be perfect. But this was a little more blatant than usual. "I can wait," he said calmly, his voice as steady as the rest of him. "But I'd still like to speak with the branch manager." Megan sighed, as though Elliot were asking her to mop the entire building, "Sir. Unless you're a client here. I'm afraid the manager doesn't have time for walk-ins." "I'm not here to make a withdrawal," Elliot answered. "Then what are you here for?" Megan shot back, her voice rising slightly. "Because I don't really have the patience today for." "Is there a problem?" A man's voice cut across the lobby. It came from Eduardo, a Latino man in his late 40s, wearing a blue name tag that read, "Client Services Representative." He'd walked in from the side hallway and was now watching the scene, with tight lips and a furrowed brow. Megan didn't even glance his way. "I've got it, Eduardo." Eduardo didn't move. "Miss Alcott," he said, voice lower now, "you might want to lower your tone." I said, "I've got it." She snapped. Elliot looked at Eduardo for a long second. He nodded once, just enough to show he appreciated the gesture. Then, with the kind of patience that only comes from a lifetime of having to teach people how to treat you, Elliot turned back to Megan. "Please," he said again. "Just the manager, that's all I'm asking." Megan rolled her eyes, grabbed a clipboard, and slapped it on the desk in front of him. "Fine, write down your name. Someone might get to you in an hour." But Elliot didn't touch the clipboard. Instead, he calmly opened a leather folder resting on his lap. But before he could pull anything out, the mother and son in the waiting room exchanged glances, and the room, already tense, seemed to hold its breath. Megan leaned against the counter, pretending not to notice Elliot, unfolding the document from his leather folder. She turned slightly toward Eduardo, muttering just loud enough, "I don't know why some people think demanding attention gets them somewhere." Eduardo didn't respond, he just stood there, arms crossed, watching. Elliot took his time, he wasn't flustered. If anything, he looked like a man who had watched this sort of thing happen far too often to be surprised anymore. He slid a tri-folded sheet of paper onto the counter and tapped it once. "I'd appreciate it if you could hand this to your branch manager," he said. Megan scoffed. "Sir, we don't accept unsolicited paperwork. If this is about a complaint, we have an online." "It's not a complaint," Elliot said evenly. "It's documentation." "I already told you," she interrupted, her voice louder. "Now you're not on the appointment schedule, so unless you're depositing something or seeing a banker, you can wait just like everyone else." A murmur stirred from behind one of the clients, near the coffee station. A woman in scrubs holding a to-go cup shifted her weight and whispered to the man next to her. "She's talking to him like he's a child." He didn't need defending, but people were beginning to notice. Megan, still not sensing the shift in the room, shoved the paper aside with a manicured fingernail and gave Elliot a tight smile. That didn't reach her eyes. "If you're not going to sign in, I'm going to have to ask you to move out of the reception area." Elliot leaned back slightly in his chair. Not a retreat, more like someone taking inventory. He turned to Eduardo. "Would you mind taking a look at this, please?" Eduardo stepped forward without hesitation. Megan immediately tried to stop him. "He doesn't need to," but Eduardo held up a hand. Not to Elliot, but to her. A quiet, firm gesture. He picked up the document, scanned it quickly, and then his eyes widened. This is from corporate," he said. Megan frowned. "What?" Eduardo didn't respond right away. He took a few steps back from the counter and read the bottom of the document again. "I think you should get Brian now." Megan hesitated. "For what? He's with now?" Eduardo repeated, voice firm. She blinked. Eduardo didn't say anything, but the look he gave her said plenty. With a loud sigh, Megan grabbed the office phone behind the counter and pressed 2 buttons. She turned her back to the lobby as she spoke into the receiver, her voice muffled. Elliot didn't watch her. He was looking around the room. Clients were no longer pretending not to listen. Some were watching openly. One older man in a flannel jacket gave him a small nod. Another woman clutched her purse tighter, but didn't look away from the corner. The teenager who'd come with his mother had pulled out his phone, not to record, just to text, but his eyes never left Elliot. Then Megan hung up. "He'll be out when he can," she muttered, stepping away from the desk, like she wanted to disassociate from the entire situation. Elliot glanced at Eduardo again. "Thank you." Eduardo gave a slight nod. "We don't get many visits from corporate." "I didn't recognize you, sir." "That's the idea," Elliot replied. And now Megan heard him. Really heard him for the first time. "Corporate," she repeated. Her tone was flatter, now cautious. "You work for Guardian State?" Elliot didn't answer. Instead, he turned to face the lobby again, resting his hands lightly on the wheels of his chair. His posture was still calm, but there was something about the way he looked at the floor, like he was waiting for something to snap into place. But Megan hadn't pieced it together yet, and her mistake was thinking. She still had control of the room. Megan paced behind the counter now, arms folded tightly, tapping her nails against her sleeve. Her earlier smugness had drained into something brittle. You could hear it in her silence. But she still hadn't apologized. Still hadn't asked for clarification. She was waiting, banking on the idea that whatever this man claimed, it could be explained away. Across the lobby, Terrence Holland, one of the youngest tellers on staff, had paused mid-transaction. The moment felt heavier than it should have. He excused himself from his client, an elderly woman depositing her retirement check, and walked back to his station, where he leaned against the glass partition. Eyes on Elliot, he'd seen the whole thing. The way Megan had spoken to him, the way she dismissed Eduardo, who was easily the most respectful person on staff. Terrence reached into his pocket and tapped open his camera app. He didn't hit record right away. He hesitated, then quietly hit the button. In the corner, the teenager who'd been watching Elliot whispered something to his mom. "Mom, is he like some kind of undercover boss?" She glanced at Elliot, then at Megan, then back at her son. "He doesn't need to be undercover," she said. "He's got presence." Look how quiet she got all of a sudden. They weren't wrong. Megan wasn't talking anymore. She kept looking toward the hallway, willing someone, anyone, to step out and make this stop. She shot Eduardo a glare, but he had returned to his desk, typing something quietly, deliberately ignoring her. The front doors opened again, and a middle-aged woman in a power suit stepped in, paused and looked around, like she'd walked into the middle of something she wasn't ready for. She stopped short when she saw Elliot, then seemed to consider her next steps. She turned and walked straight toward the reception desk. Megan perked up high. "Welcome to Guardian State. I can help you in just I'm not here for a transaction." The woman said her name was Judith Emery, a regional investment client who'd worked with the bank for over a decade. Megan recognized her face but couldn't quite place her. Judith stepped over to Elliot and bent down just enough to speak, without the whole room hearing. "Mr. Dandridge," she said warmly, "I didn't know you'd be here today." He gave her a small smile. Neither did she. Judith looked up, locking eyes with Megan. "Is that so?" Megan opened her mouth, but couldn't get past the first syllable. She stared at Judith like she wanted to ask, "How do you know him?" But no words came out. Judith straightened. "I'll be waiting over there. I was told you'd be making a visit sometime this month. I'm just glad I happened to be here." She looked around. "I see you're already making an impact." Elliot chuckled softly, unintended, but noted. Judith walked to a chair by the window, pulled out her planner and began to write. Terrence looked from her to Elliot. Then back at his phone. He stopped recording. This wasn't a fight, this was a reveal. The air had shifted, and even the clients, who weren't sure exactly what was going on, could feel it. Megan finally walked back toward the reception desk. She moved slower now. "I didn't know," she said, looking down at the edge of the desk. "I didn't know who you were," Elliot replied without looking at her. "That's the point." She paused. "If I had known, I wonder." Elliot cut in, his tone still gentle. "Would you have spoken to me differently? If I looked the same but wasn't someone important?" The question hung in the air like smoke. No one moved. No one filled the silence. Even the usual clatter of keyboards and conversations had stopped. Terence glanced at Eduardo, who was now watching quietly from across the room. Megan said nothing, but the hallway door finally clicked open, and the manager was coming. Megan's last chance to save face was walking straight toward her. The hallway door swung open, and Brian Covington stepped out. He was a tall man in his early 50s, built like a former college linebacker, with neatly combed hair that had surrendered to streaks of gray. His tie was slightly loosened, and his reading glasses dangled from the front pocket of his dress shirt. He looked like someone who could read people within seconds, and right now he was already assessing the room. His eyes landed on Megan first. Her shoulders straightened. But she didn't speak, she waited. Then he looked at Elliot. Their eyes met. And something clicked in Brian's expression. A flicker of recognition. It wasn't full-blown panic. But close, Mr. Dandridge. Brian asked, stepping forward, his voice low but respectful. Elliot gave a slight nod. Brian. That alone was enough to make the front desk feel 10 degrees. Colder. Brian moved closer, extending his hand. Elliot reached up and shook it firm and steady. I wasn't told you'd be visiting this location today, Brian said carefully. I like to keep things simple, Elliot replied. Surprise visits help me see things for what they really are. Brian nodded, slowly understood. Megan looked between them, confused. Now wait, he's not just from corporate. Brian turned to her with a tight expression. Megan, we'll speak later. She hesitated, swallowing hard. I just didn't. He cut her off with a glance. Not rude, not loud, but definitive, Mr. Dandridge. Would you like to come into my office? Brian asked. Elliot motioned to the counter. I already submitted a document. That should explain why I'm here. Brian took the folded paper from Eduardo, who had silently walked it over and scanned it quickly. His jaw clenched, then he stepped to the side. Follow me, please. Elliot nodded and turned his chair toward the hallway, but he paused midway and looked back at Megan. I assume you have cameras in this branch? He asked. Brian answered without hesitation. Yes, sir. 6-point coverage synced to the internal server. Good, Elliot said. I'd like to review this morning's footage. Before we continue, Brian's face tightened. Absolutely. Megan stepped forward now, voice cracking. Mr. Dandridge, I didn't mean anything, I just didn't know. Elliot studied her, not cruelly, not angrily, just directly. You meant exactly what you said. That's the problem. He turned and wheeled himself down the hallway, leaving Megan standing there, visibly shrinking. Clance whispered. Judith, still seated by the window, closed her planner and gave Megan a look that could only be described as disappointed. Terence put his phone away. He didn't need the video anymore. The truth was already louder than any clip could have been. Back in the hallway, Brian opened the door to his office and stepped aside to let Elliot in. Would you like anything? Coffee? Water? He asked. No, thank you, Elliot replied. Brian sat behind his desk, opened his laptop and logged in. I'll cue up the footage now. They sat in silence for a few seconds, the hum of the computer filling the space. Brian tapped a few keys, and brought up the security timeline. He rewound the feed to 9:03 a.m. Elliot watched as the scene played back. His entrance. Megan's words, Eduardo's reaction. The crowd shifting. I need a copy of this sent to legal. Elliot said already done. Brian said without blinking. Elliot looked over at him. Brian nodded once. The moment Eduardo brought me the paper, I knew I'm not trying to fire people. Brian, Elliot said, his voice soft. But I also didn't come here to be spoken to. Like a street beggar, I understand. Brian rubbed the back of his neck. He looked tired now. There are things we've overlooked. He said, I've let Megan slide before. Sharp tongue, decent performance metrics. But today, this was something else. Elliot didn't respond. He didn't need to. The footage was still playing. And Megan's voice was crystal clear. But outside the office, the lobby was stirring, and a silent message was spreading. From person to person, things were changing today. And it wouldn't stop with Megan. Back in the lobby, the noise didn't return. People still spoke in hushed tones. But it was the kind of quiet that follows a line. Being crossed, everyone had seen something they weren't supposed to see. But no one was pretending anymore. Megan remained at the counter, arms locked tight over her chest. She kept glancing toward the hallway, like a school kid waiting for a principal's verdict. But the calm confidence she had worn earlier was gone. Her jaw moved, slightly, like she was chewing on invisible words, trying to find something, anything, to say that might untangle what had just happened. Terrence stood near the telebooths, fidgeting with a paperclip. He wanted to walk away back to his desk, back to the rhythm of deposits and transfers. But something held him there. Maybe curiosity, maybe something heavier. He glanced at Eduardo, who hadn't moved from his post. Their eyes met, and Terrence said quietly, "Is this really happening?" Eduardo nodded once, every bit of it behind them. Judith stood up, brushing off her skirt. She walked over to the waiting area and addressed the room, not loudly, but with poise. For those wondering, she said, "That man is not just part of corporate. He owns part of this bank." Heads turned, a few jaws dropped. Someone in the back whispered, "No way." Judith gave a small shrug. "I've worked with him, brilliant investor. Private, doesn't talk much. But when he does," she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. One of the older clients, Mr. Fairley, who'd been banking there for 20 years, spoke for the first time. So he let her speak to him like that and just waited. Judith nodded. That's how he works. He watches before he acts. Megan's head whipped around. "This is crazy," she said. Half laughing, "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just trying to follow protocol." But no one responded, not a word. Megan looked to Terrence, maybe hoping for backup. He looked away. She looked at Eduardo. He didn't flinch. "We both heard what you said, Megan. You know I didn't mean it like that," she said, voice rising. "It was just a joke." "Were you laughing?" Eduardo asked calmly. She didn't answer. The hallway door opened again. Brian stepped out first, holding a small folder under his arm. Elliot followed, his hands on the rims of his wheels. Face unreadable, Brian walked straight to Megan. "Come with me, please," he said. "Why?" "What are you?" she started, but stopped herself. Something in his tone told her. This wasn't a conversation. They disappeared into the back. The lobby fell quiet again. Elliot looked over the room. He didn't speak, didn't gesture. He just scanned the faces. Some looked embarrassed, some curious, one or two ashamed. He slowly wheeled over to Terrence. "You were recording earlier," Elliot said, not as an accusation, just a fact. Terrence cleared his throat. "Yeah, I thought it might help in case she denied it." "You can delete it," Elliot said. Terrence blinked. "Sir, there's no need," Elliot said. "The lesson's already here." Terrence nodded quietly, deleting the clip from his phone. "I wasn't sure what to do. She outranks me. I didn't want to get involved." "You did fine," Elliot said. "The hard part isn't speaking up. It's knowing when to stay calm, while the truth shows itself." Across the room, the teenage boy whispered, "He's not what I expected." His mother smiled. "That's the point, baby. People never are." Elliot heard her. He didn't turn, but his shoulders relaxed a bit. But in the back office, a very different conversation was about to begin, and it wouldn't leave Megan with many options. Brian shut the door softly behind them. Megan stood in the middle of the office, like the floor might give out. She didn't sit, she didn't speak. Her arms stayed crossed. But it wasn't out of confidence anymore. It was armor. Brian placed the folder on the desk and opened it. Slowly, carefully. Inside were printouts of the surveillance stills, pulled just minutes earlier. Her face was in every one of them. "I want to be very clear with you," he said. "This isn't just a review. This is documentation." Megan's voice cracked when she finally spoke. "You're not serious. I'm not playing," Brian replied. "Do you know how many people saw what happened out there?" "I didn't know who he was," she said again. Desperation creeping in now. "If I had known." "Stop," he said flatly. She blinked. Brian tapped his pen on the table. "Do you honestly believe it's acceptable to speak to anyone that way? You think the problem was not knowing he was corporate, or that he was an owner?" "I didn't mean it," she muttered. Brian leaned back. "You meant every word. You just didn't mean to be caught." Megan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked smaller now, less polished. The cracks in her armor were showing. Brian leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Do you understand the position? You've put this entire branch in. That man didn't show up to fire anyone. He came to observe. That's all you gave him. A show he'll never forget. I can apologize publicly to him, to everyone," she said. Reaching for a lifeline, Brian didn't budge. "Do you think an apology rewrites the way you treated someone you thought had no power?" She looked down. He continued. "I've had complaints about your tone before. Clients, even staff. I let it slide. Because you moved numbers and followed procedures. But that ends now." Megan's throat tightened. "You're really letting me go?" Brian folded his hands, "Not because he told me to. Because I should have done this sooner." She stared at him as if hoping to find even the tiniest crack of mercy in his face, but it wasn't there. "Not anymore. I need your badge and login credentials," he said. She hesitated a second. "Too long, Megan," he said again. She finally unclipped her name tag and set it on the desk with shaking hands. Then silently, she typed her deactivation code onto the company iPad. When she was done, she looked up. He humiliated me, no. Brian said calmly. You did that to yourself. She took a slow breath, turned and left without another word. Outside the office, Elliot sat quietly by the front desk. Judith had returned to her seat. The rest of the room had fallen back into that strange hush, but no one had left. The second Megan appeared. Badge gone, her coat folded over her arm. The room shifted, not with cheers, not even with gasps, just recognition. She didn't look at anyone as she walked out. Didn't speak, didn't meet a single eye. The door clicked shut behind her. Elliot looked up at Brian. All done? He asked. Brian gave a single nod. Then I'd like to speak to the team. Elliot said. Brian looked toward the staff lounge. I'll bring them in. He disappeared for a few moments. And when he returned, 6 employees followed behind him. Eduardo Terrence, a young woman from the loans desk. 2 tellers, even the janitor. They all stood in a quiet semicircle, near the waiting area, unsure what to expect. Elliot didn't rise. He stayed in his chair, just as he had when he entered. But his voice, when he finally spoke, carried across the room, like someone who'd been holding it in for years. But before the first sentence left his mouth, everyone could feel it. This wasn't going to be about punishment. It was going to be about something bigger. Elliot looked at the staff gathered in front of him, not with anger, not with scorn, but with the quiet gravity of someone who'd lived long enough to know exactly how people work. His hands rested gently on the arms of his chair, and when he spoke, there was no performance in his voice. Just truth. I didn't come here today to trap anyone. He began. I didn't come to catch someone slipping, or to fire a person. That's not my role. No one moved. I came because every few months I visit our branches. I don't announce it. I don't wear a suit. I just show up, sit, watch. Ask simple questions, not to test your banking skills, but to see how people are treated when they look like they have nothing to offer you. Terrence lowered his eyes. The woman from loans shifted her stance. Even Eduardo looked like he was holding his breath. Today, Elliot continued. I wasn't addressed as a client. I wasn't addressed as a man. I wasn't even addressed as a human being. I was spoken to like a problem, like an inconvenience. He paused, and the only reason that changed was when Megan realized I had power. The silence was dense now, not uncomfortable but weighty, the kind that made every person think about what they'd do if it had been them behind the desk. I've spent most of my adult life being underestimated. Dismissed. Looked past, Elliot said, voice still calm. And that's fine. I don't need attention. I've built my life quietly without needing validation. He turned slightly to look at Terrence. But you saw something wasn't right and you pressed record. You didn't say a word, but you knew it mattered. That takes something. Terrence looked stunned. I didn't know what else to do. That's okay, Elliot said. You didn't need to fix it. You just needed to acknowledge it. And you did. Then he looked at Eduardo. You spoke up not to protect me, but because it was the right thing to do. That means more than you know. Eduardo nodded, a little overwhelmed. Honestly, I thought I'd get written up. Elliot gave a faint smile. Maybe in another bank, not this one. He turned back to the group. Some of you said nothing. I understand. It's hard when someone above you is doing wrong. Most people freeze, but I want you to remember something. He leaned forward slightly, voice a little firmer, the way you treat a person. When you think they can't help you, that's the version of yourself the world remembers. No one blinked. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to save the day. But you do have to try. Every time someone walks through that door, they're trusting you with more than money. They're trusting you not to humiliate them, not to reduce them. Judith, still standing near the side, quietly wiped a tear from her eye. Elliot took a breath. Megan lost her job today. Not because of me. Because she exposed something in herself that shouldn't exist in a place built on trust. He looked around one more time. This branch can be better. You can set the tone. You can create a place where no one questions. If they belong, that choice isn't mine. It's yours. Brian stepped forward, clearing his throat. I think we all needed to hear that. Sir. Elliot nodded slowly. Then let's hope you take it with you. He started to wheel himself back toward the front doors. No applause followed, no grand gestures. Just the quiet hum of people, processing what they'd just witnessed. But as he reached the lobby entrance, something unexpected happened. Someone stepped forward quietly, respectfully, to speak not as an employee or client, but as a person. The person who stepped forward was the janitor. Clarence Duval, 65 years old. Slow-moving and always in early. Before the staff even punched in, most barely noticed him, unless he was pushing a mop or emptying bins. But Elliot did. Clarence nodded once. Sir, I just want to say thank you for how you handled this. Elliot turned slightly in his chair. And what's your name, Clarence? Clarence Duval. Elliot gave a quiet smile. Pleasure to meet you, Clarence. Clarence looked down, then back up. Been working in this branch since they opened 30 years. Maybe more. I've seen people come and go. I've seen people promoted who didn't know how to look others in the eye. He didn't say Megan's name. He didn't have to. Clarence's voice wavered a bit. I've cleaned up after folks who thought they were too good to say hello. That kind of thing stays with a man. Elliot nodded slowly. Respect doesn't come from a title. No, sir. Clarence replied, it sure doesn't. Terence was still standing near the teller's station, watching all of this unfold, like he'd stumbled into a story he wasn't expecting to be part of. The woman from loans stepped forward now hesitantly. I didn't know what to say earlier, but I saw what happened. And I should have said something. Elliot looked at her gently. And now you have. She seemed surprised by his response, like she was waiting to be scolded, not acknowledged. Then came the quiet shuffle of chairs. A few clients began to collect their things. Some whispered their goodbyes, but no one moved quickly. They lingered, like they were still trying to understand the weight of what they'd seen. Near the door, Judith caught up to Elliot one more time. If you ever decide to take a public-facing role, she said with a smile, I'll be the first in line to vote for you. He chuckled. No campaign signs in my future. Judith leaned in slightly. That speech, it'll stay with people. Let's hope their actions match it, Elliot replied. Brian joined them near the door, holding a sealed envelope. I drafted an apology letter from the branch, addressed to you personally, though I doubt it captures the full extent of the day. Elliot accepted the envelope, but didn't open it. "I'm not here for apologies, Brian," he said. "I'm here to see who this branch really is. And I saw it today." Brian glanced over his shoulder at the staff. "Will be better, don't tell me." Elliot said, "Show them." They stood in silence for a moment. Then Brian extended a hand. Elliot took it back at the reception desk. Megan's absence felt glaring. The empty chair, the untouched clipboard. It all sat there, like a reminder of what had just played out. Elliot began to wheel himself to the door, but before he could reach it, Terence caught up to him. "Mr. Dandridge," he asked, a little breathless. Elliot stopped. Terence rubbed his palms together, nervous. "I was wondering, would you be willing to come back? Not to inspect us or anything, but to speak to the new hires or even the interns. I think people would really benefit from hearing you." Again, Elliot paused. "That's not my job, son." "I know," Terence said quickly. "But I think it matters." There was something in the way Terence said it that landed, not flattery, not obligation, just belief. Elliot considered that. "I'll think about it." Terence nodded. "Thank you for today." Outside, the automatic doors opened. Sunlight spilled into the lobby again. As Elliot rolled forward, a woman, one of the clients, stepped ahead and held the door for him. Not because he needed it, not because she had to, but because it was decent. Elliot looked up at her. She just smiled and said, "Have a good day, sir." "You too," he said quietly. He passed through the door, down the ramp and into the quiet of the parking lot. But even as he disappeared from view, everyone inside the branch knew something had shifted. Not just in policy, but in perspective. The branch stayed quiet long after Elliot was gone. Brian stood in the lobby, arms crossed, watching the staff return to their duties one by one. There was no laughter, no chit-chat, no casual shuffling of papers to break the tension, just the sound of realignment. People reevaluating what they thought they knew about the place they worked. In the break room, Terence sat with Eduardo, each quietly sipping from paper cups. Eduardo looked up. "You ever seen something like that?" he asked. Terence shook his head. "Not in real life, only in movies. But this felt more honest." Eduardo nodded slowly. "That's because it was." Down the hall, Clarence was pushing his mop across the tile, a little slower than usual. He stopped near the front window and looked out, eyes scanning the parking lot where Elliot had vanished. He didn't smile, but there was a lightness to his face. A quiet satisfaction, maybe. Brian eventually walked back to his office, the envelope Elliot had left untouched. Still in his hand, he placed it in a locked drawer. Not because it needed to be hidden, but because some things didn't require display. They just needed to exist. An hour passed. Then 2 clients came and went. Transactions resumed. The phones rang again on the surface. Everything returned to normal. But it wasn't the same Terence. Now greeted each person at his counter, with direct eye contact. The young woman from loans asked 3 times if her client needed anything else. Eduardo stayed near the front desk longer than usual, not hovering, but watching. And Megan's absence echoed louder than any reprimand could have. By late afternoon, Judith had already placed a call to corporate, giving her version of events detailed, accurate and respectful. She didn't embellish. She didn't exaggerate. She simply told the truth. I've worked with Guardian State for a long time, she said over the phone. And today I saw something I hope you never forget. Your people don't need more training. They need more listening. That quote would later circulate quietly through the upper offices, back at the branch. The teenager who'd sat with his mom that morning returned after school with a $5 bill. He walked up to the counter where Terrence stood and said, "I just wanted to say I thought that guy was cool. I liked the way he didn't yell." Terrence smiled. "Me too." The boy looked at the deposit slip in his hand. "I want to open an account here." Terrence handed him a pen. "Best decision you'll make today." In that one gesture, a simple interaction between a kid and a bank employee, the mood of the day found its purpose. It wasn't about who got fired or who gave the best speech. It was about something smaller, something rooted in dignity. Outside, the sun began to dip. The glass walls of the bank caught the gold light, casting long shadows across the lobby. Clarence turned off the floor buffer. Eduardo locked his drawer. Terrence double-checked the counters. Then Brian stepped into the center of the lobby, looked around and spoke softly. "Let's make sure we never need a reminder like that." Again, no one responded. But they heard him, and in a building where words had carried so much weight. That day, silence finally felt earned, because power doesn't always come loud, and character that's shown when no one's looking. This wasn't just a story about a man in a wheelchair or a rude employee. It was a story about perception and what happens when people reveal who they really are in a world where kindness often takes a back seat to status. Elliot Dandridge reminded everyone that real power doesn't walk into a room demanding recognition. It watches, it listens, and when the moment calls for it, it teaches. If this story made you feel something, share it. If it made you reflect, sit with that. And if it made you realize how you treat people matters more than anything on your resume, then do something about it. Subscribe for more true-to-life stories that make us pause, think, and maybe, just maybe, grow a little better.